Welcome to everyone who's entering, and I'm just admitting more people here, and we'll start in just a couple of minutes.
Yes.
Is that all there is? There was a lot. Can you see? It can't be off though.
So I'm just admitting a couple people, and we will get started shortly. Welcome to everyone who's arrived so far. Okay, so the tricky part is always noticing when someone's in the waiting room and doing that and doing the presenting at the same time. So I hope that it's not too distracting to you as you're watching. So good evening. My name is Jane Garver. I am the Executive Director at the Little Traverse Historical Society here in Petoskey, and we are celebrating our 50th anniversary as a museum. And this is part of our 50-year celebration. So this program was originally presented in October 1974 at the museum. They had just in the museum and only opened in August of that year. The program that evening was focused on organizing a fundraiser to put the clock back on the waterfront. I will be sharing the history of the clock, including that attempt to get the clock back to the waterfront. So our story actually begins with Mary Curtis. She was born in New York City on February 17th, 1846. Her name was Mary Wooding at the time. Her family moved to Michigan when she was 12 because her father thought it would be a great adventure to become a farmer. And he bought a farm near Climax, Michigan. Mary was sent back to New York City for her education, and she met and married William L. Curtis in the Kalamazoo area when she returned again from New York City. They came to Petoskey on the first train from Grand Rapids. The Curtis family was involved in banking in Grand Rapids, and the railroad invited dignitaries like the mayor of Grand Rapids and the bankers and things like that to ride on the first train that came to Petoskey after the tracks were finished, and the Curtises were on that train. They liked Petoskey, liked what they saw, and moved back to moved to Petoskey in 1882. Mary Curtis was very involved in the community. She was involved in the Presbyterian Church, the library board, the Curtis Park Club, named for her husband, the DAR, and she was on several committees of the Women's Federated Clubs, including the Library Committee and the Juvenile Court Committee. Mrs. Curtis donated the fountain for Mineral Well Park. And she also donated the clock and bell for the new Emmett County Courthouse that was being built in Petoskey. The county seat was moving from Harbor Springs to Petoskey, and Mrs. Curtis decided that she would donate the clock, or a clock, and a bell. So she worked with the jeweler, Mr. Siebert, to find a clockmaker that could make such a clock. She purchased it with the intent of placing it at the courthouse. A tower was built for it. She also donated additional money in 1916 to have the clock wired so that it could be illuminated at night. So this article is from February 7th, 1902, and it describes her gift to the city. So many sources that were written later in the 1960s and 70s say that Mrs. Curtis bought the clock and bell at the Buffalo Exposition of 1901. So we know she went to the exposition. Here's an article from October 1901. It's just one of those little tea table articles that says Mr. and Mrs. Lewis, Mrs. Cushman, and Mrs. Curtis are at the Buffalo Exposition. So we know that she went there. The Pan American Exposition was held at Buffalo, New York. It operated from May to November in 1901. So here we have a program and also a map or plan of the exposition. I feel like I'm hearing a little bit of an echo, so if you're not muted, maybe you could mute, and then we'll just unmute for questions. I'm sorry, I forgot to say that at the beginning. So again, this is a program and a map of the Buffalo Exposition, also known as the Pan American Exposition.
That.
This this is an illuminated picture of the exposition. So one of the big attractions was that it was electrified. So it was all lit up at night, and it would have been quite a spectacle for people to see. The lights, the electric lights were generated with power through Niagara Falls. And however, the exposition is mostly known for the fact that President McKinley was shot and later died at the exposition, or he didn't die at the exposition, but he was shot there. So when you look at this picture and you look at that tower, or at least when I do, I think, oh, so that's where the clock was, because all these newspaper articles later on say that Mrs. Curtis went to the Buffalo Exposition and she bought the clock. But I've been in touch with the Buffalo Museum, and they say there was not a clock on that tower. There wasn't a clock anywhere that they could find. They don't have any pictures that show a clock. I sent them pictures of our clock. They didn't see any pictures of anything like that. However, it may have been there. There was kind of like a garage sale, a salvage sale after the exposition. It was held in Chicago. So she could have gone to Chicago to get the clock. they were selling off all kinds of pieces from the exposition, which I thought was fascinating. And there's a catalog of the different things they were selling. I didn't find a clock in the catalog, but I didn't read all 400 pages of it either. The Buffalo Museum also said that there were vendors at the exposition, and maybe the watchmaker or clockmaker was one of the vendors. However, they couldn't find them listed there either. So it's a mystery how the piece that she bought the clock at the exposition came to be. I haven't found any evidence of that other than stories that were written much later. However, somehow Mrs. Curtis got the clock and it came to Petoskey. The 4 clock faces are 8 feet in diameter. They weigh 500 pounds. They were manufactured by the E. Howard Watch and Clock Company of Waltham, Massachusetts. And that information is on the Clockworks. So we know that that is true. Oh, and this picture was amusing to me because it was printed in the paper in, I think 65 or 66, right before they were going to tear down the courthouse. And they said, this is a mystery. Why was the clock at one time painted black with white hands? But if you really examine the picture, it's just a negative. This one on the right is just a negative because everything is opposite. The garage doors too. So I thought that was interesting. The bell is inscribed, donated to the city of Petoskey by Mrs. W. L. Curtis, 1902. And I know in this picture you can't really see the inscription, but I have zoomed in on it and it is there. It is also supposed to be a replica of the Liberty Bell. So the courthouse stood until 1966. They began, well, 1965. So they began tearing it down. This is an ad that you could buy everything, the lumber and the doors and everything when they tore it down. So the clock faces were removed and placed in storage. And we have several interesting pictures of the clock faces being removed. And it really shows how big they are. So here's one of the clock faces coming out of the courthouse. Here's some of the inner workings. And that's where this picture on the right is one that shows who the maker was. This one I love because you really can see up there 8 feet tall with those guys standing next to the clock face. And then here they are with the empty spot where the clock was. Harriet Kilbourne, who had recently created the or helped to establish the Little Traverse Historical Society. One of the first things that she did and that the Historical Society worked on was working to save the. So when the courthouse was being torn down, they didn't just tear down the clock with it or sell it to somebody else. It was saved. And Harriet was part of that. So we have a lot of Harriet's letters because she was part of establishing the Historical Society. A lot of her letters are still in our archive. So in this one, she was writing to people about what she had done and how the Historical Society had plans for putting the clock somewhere, like on a tower or something. So she says the tower would house the old town clock, which was taken down when the courthouse was wrecked this year. But then she said later to another person, the citizenry by and large got on my back to save the clock. So she felt like a lot of people were telling her, you're the Historical Society, you need to save the clock. And she says, I managed to get it saved, and now they say, what are you going to do with it? So she was frustrated that she did all the work to save it, and then she was expected to figure out what the heck to do with all of this clock and the bell. And it's huge. So the Historical Society started doing fundraisers to put the clock somewhere. And you can see here, we have many, many, many files from this, these different fundraiser donations that they were doing. Den 6, I assume Cub Scouts. Sonny Hemingway was a donor. Many members of the Curtis family donated again, even though their family was they were the ones who purchased it in the first place. So lots and lots and lots of people. Those are pages and pages of donor lists in that photograph. One of the ideas that they had was that they would get a plaque or several plaques with names. And so I still have at the museum archives samples of the little name plates that they were going to put on to these plaques. I don't think that they ever did that. I haven't seen one anywhere. Another fundraiser was commemorative plates. So remember, the museum had just opened in 1974. And so this was one of the first projects that they were working on. And so they had these commemorative plates that were sold at Roosh Jewelers, among other places. And this was considered a fundraiser for putting the clock back on the waterfront. So their first idea was that they would put it on a tower. So it had been on the courthouse tower. It's a really big clock. And so they thought they would put it on a tower. They thought this would be a great bicentennial project. So it's 1974, 1976 is coming up. The city has a bicentennial committee. And so a part of that bicentennial committee was the clock committee. And that involved George Zipp, Bill Barney, and Dr. Ben Bloom. So at that October meeting that I told you about that we're sort of recreating this evening, they displayed a bunch of articles about the clock and one of the clock faces. So that must have been a pretty interesting display. So they thought they could use the Cogomic Tannery water tower. And they contacted the Cogomic Tannery, which had closed or was closing. And so they were talking to them about scrap and how maybe they could donate it to the city or to the museum as a donation and get this tower. So they have several photographs of the tower that they were displaying at that October 1974 meeting, along with these drawings of what it could potentially look like if they transformed it into a clock tower. And they said it would be about 94 feet high. So here you can see an altered photograph, and we know that the original photograph is an old one before 1915 because the Arlington Hotel is still standing there on the far left. But the red roof is the current museum, the former Chicago and West Michigan Railroad Depot. And then on the right, you can see someone has drawn in, if we put the tower there, because there used to be a water tower. And so what if we made it into a clock tower? So they were just displaying that as a possible place for the clock. The plan was changed, however, since they had just opened the museum. They got a lot of feedback from people who said, why not put it on the museum? You've just opened the museum, you've just renovated, and wouldn't it be great if you put the clock right on the museum? So then they started doing drawings, and this is actually a photograph where they painted whiteout, I think, on it, because what they decided they would have to do is raise the roof of the museum in order to make the clock faces fit. And so this is a drawing on top of a photograph where they were trying to show what that might look like. They also had some pen and ink drawings, which that was interesting to me because it shows the depot before it was enclosed for a museum there on the left. And then on the right is a little 3D model that they made that I found in the archives, trying to work with that conical roof. And I think what they were trying to show is that we do need to raise the roof because it would be really difficult to put it right onto the conical roof. But it's a cute little 3D attempt to show that. Then they received a letter from the Historical Society of Michigan. And the Historical Society of Michigan said, if you raise the roof of that building, then you will no longer be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So the really interesting part to me was that the Historical Society board voted to ignore the letter and said they didn't care if they lost the listing on the National Registry of Historic Places because they thought the clock was really that important to the town. And the clock meant a lot more to the townspeople than the National Registry. So they decided they were going to go ahead and raise the roof and here's about the registry. And they had a lot of articles, letters to the editor that talked about people's memories of hearing the clock ring from the courthouse and how everyone in town needs a clock to be able to tell time, which is an interesting thought because today we wouldn't think, oh, yes, we definitely need a town clock so we can tell time, although I do like to listen to it. So they were going to go ahead with this plan. However, they also discovered that it was going to cost too much money to raise the roof. And that was really what made them not raise the roof in the end. So never fear, it hasn't been altered and altered back. So they decided that at first they would put the bell at the museum and ring the bell every time someone donated $100. So that was the new plan. So in December 1975, they installed the bell at the museum and it tolled on midnight, January 1st, 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial. So here they are installing the bell. And I love that. I think this is Bob Greenwell, and it looks like he's got a cigar as he's trying to lift this 800-pound bell. So that's kind of a funny picture to me. But here they are ringing the bell every time they get a $100 donation. And then they ended up installing 2 of the clock faces in 1977. So they spent all this time fundraising and then finally installed the clock faces. However, the weight of the bell and the clock mechanism was taking up too much space on the second floor. And if you've been up in the office, you know that it's very crowded up there. And I can't imagine if I had to try to work up there with the clock mechanism also. So because of the weight of the bell, the space that the mechanism was taking up, the bell and the clock faces were again taken down and they were stored in the city's Washington Street garage in October 1988. Do you remember the old waterfront? Well, Waterfront renovations began in the early 1990s, and the clock was to be a part of that plan. The clock had to be sent to Cincinnati for repairs before it was added to the waterfront park. The inner workings were discarded. One face had to be partially rebuilt. The arms were remanufactured from a pattern made from the original arms. And the bell got a new electric impulse hammer, and the clock and the bell can now be run by computer. So here's some waterfront renovation. And here comes the clock. It was installed on the Waterfront Promenade, May 21st, 1996. So here we see the tower, and it looks so much bigger when you see it down closer to the ground. And here's installing the bell. And there is, I just like this picture really, but there is some maintenance that needs to be done. So the clock is illuminated and they have to change all the light bulbs every 2 years or so. So here it is, the Bayfront clock. That's one of my favorite places to take visitors when we go on a walking tour to take a picture. They love this iconic picture with the little lighthouse in the background. So great picture. The clock tower is 62 feet tall and it weighs 13 tons. So there you go. Our next program next month is November 14th. And I will be talking about our founding mothers, and that will be also a revisit of a 1974 program. I would be happy to try to answer any questions. I don't know if I know anything more than what I've already shared, but I'd be happy to try if anybody has any. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining me. And I did record this and it will be posted on our YouTube channel just as soon as I can get it there. So thanks again, everyone. And I hope that you'll consider joining us again in November for Founding Mothers. Have a good night.